The secret of the seventh passenger, of the many problems that came to my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes across the long years of our friendship. There are some I have set down quickly, while the ink of memory was still wet, and others I have kept back, turning them over in the dark the way a man turns a stone he is half afraid to lift. The affair I am about to relate belongs to the second kind. I have waited a great while to write it. I write it now only because the persons most wounded by it are beyond any further wounding, and because it remains, to my mind, the clearest demonstration I ever witnessed of a truth that Holmes was fond of repeating to me in that quiet, cutting voice of his. That the most dangerous secret in London is not the one buried under the floor, but the one standing in plain sight, wearing an ordinary coat, asking you politely to step aside. It began, as so many of our cases did, with a knock at the door of our rooms in Baker Street, long after honest men had gone to bed. It was a foul night near the end of November, the fog lying so thick upon the city that the gas lamps along the street had shrunk to small smeared halos, each one drowning in its own glow. I had heard faintly the laboring of a hansom somewhere below, the horses' hooves muffled and uncertain on the greasy stones, and then the bell, and then Mrs. Hudson's slow tread upon the stair. Holmes did not stir from his chair by the fire. He had spent the evening in a black, listless mood, sunk in his dressing gown with his knees drawn up and his pipe gone cold in his hand, complaining that London had become a city without imagination, that the criminal classes had lost all artistry, that a man might as well retire to keep bees as wait for a problem worthy of the name. "You may rouse yourself, Holmes," said I, going to the window and peering down through the murk. "Unless I am much mistaken, that is a four-wheeler behind the hansom, and a man in uniform climbing out of it in a very great hurry. 2 men. They are coming up." "At this hour," said Holmes, opening one eye. "A man in a hurry is either a fool or a man with something behind him that frightens him more than the fog. Let us hope, for the sake of my evening, that it is the latter." There were 2 of them indeed. The first through the door I knew at once. It was Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his sallow face pinched with cold and with something else besides, a kind of harried bewilderment that I had not often seen upon it. The second was a stranger, a heavy, gray-whiskered man of perhaps 60, dressed in the dark serge and brass buttons of a railway officer of high rank, with a peaked cap clutched against his chest, and an expression upon his face that I can only describe as the expression of a man who has watched the ground open beneath something he had believed to be solid all his life. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, "I am sorry to come so late, but I should have had no peace if I had waited until morning, and neither, I think, would you once you have heard it. This is Mr. Bartholomew Crewe, superintendent of the line. He came to me 2 hours ago with a story I could make neither head nor tail of, and I have learned over the years that when I can make neither head nor tail of a thing, it is generally cheaper in the end to bring it straight to you." "Sit down, both of you," said Holmes, and the listlessness had gone out of him entirely now. He was upright in his chair, his gray eyes very bright. "Mr. Crewe, you are chilled to the bone, and you have not slept, and you have come a long way tonight, twice, I think, for there is fresh mud upon your boots over older mud already dried. Take the chair nearest the fire, and tell me your trouble from the beginning, leaving nothing out, however small. It is the small things, as a rule, that turn out to matter." The superintendent lowered himself into the chair as a much older man might, and for a moment he only stared into the flames. When he spoke at last, his voice was the flat, careful voice of a man who has rehearsed a thing many times in his own head and still does not believe it. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I have served the railway for 41 years. I began as a boy oiling axle boxes, and I have ended as superintendent of the whole Northern Division. And in all that time I have prided myself upon one thing above every other, which is that I know, at any hour of the day or night, exactly where every soul upon my line is, and how he came to be there and where he is going. A railway, sir, is order. It is the one perfectly ordered thing in this disordered country. Every man has his ticket, every ticket has its place, every carriage has its number, every passenger is counted on and counted off. Nothing happens upon my line that is not written down somewhere in a ledger in a clerk's good round hand." He stopped, and his great square hands tightened on the cap in his lap. "And tonight a thing has happened that is not in any ledger, and cannot be, because by everything I know to be true it could not have happened at all." "Those," said Holmes softly, "are precisely the cases I most enjoy." "Pray go on." "You will have heard," said Crewe, "of the down express that runs through the night from the cathedral city. I will name it if you wish, but the name does not signify, reaching the London terminus a little after 6 in the morning. It is a slow, heavy train of many carriages, and it does not stop between the junction and the terminus. It runs the last stretch without a halt, 60 miles and more, through the dark and the fog, taking its water on the move from the troughs laid between the rails so that it need never pause. I tell you this because it matters. From the junction to London, that train does not stop. It cannot stop, save by the pulling of the communication cord, and the cord was not pulled. I have the guard's word, and I have the signalman's logs all down the line, every box, every signal passed at speed. The train did not stop. "I follow you," said Holmes. "Continue." "In the third carriage from the engine," the superintendent went on, "there was a first-class compartment. You will know the kind, Mr. Holmes, one of the older sort, with no corridor, no way through to the rest of the train. A box, sir, with a door upon either side opening only onto the platform, and nothing else. On our night services, we lock those doors between stations, by the company's own rule, ever since the troubles we had some years ago with robberies, and worse in just such closed compartments. The guard locks them at the junction and unlocks them at the terminus, and between those 2 points no living man can open them from within, for there is no handle that will answer, nor from without, for the train is running at 50 miles in the hour through empty country in the dark. That compartment was locked at the junction. It was unlocked at the terminus by the guard, in the presence of a porter and of myself, for I had come down to meet the train on another matter entirely. And inside that compartment, Mr. Holmes, in the corner seat, with his head fallen back against the cushion and his eyes half open, we found a passenger dead. He said the word and then was silent, and the fire snapped, and the fog pressed gray and blind against the window. "A passenger dead," Holmes repeated. "That alone is no impossibility. Men die upon trains. Tell me what makes this death a problem and not a misfortune." "Two things," said Crewe. "When first we saw him, we took it for a natural death, an apoplexy, a seizure of the heart. He was a man of full habit, flushed, and there was no mark upon him that any of us could see, and no disorder in the compartment beyond what a sleeping man might make. The company surgeon was sent for. He came grumbling, expecting to sign a certificate and go back to his bed. And then he found the mark. The superintendent touched the back of his own neck, just at the top of the spine with one blunt finger, and I saw him shudder. "A wound, Mr. Holmes. A single small wound, no wider than a darning needle, driven up beneath the skull at the base of the neck, where the hair hides it and where a man would never feel for it. The surgeon says death would have been near instant and near silent. That man did not die of God's visitation. He was murdered, sir, murdered by a hand that knew exactly where to strike. And the second thing," said Holmes. I had seen him grow very still, the stillness of a hound that has caught a scent. "The second thing," said Crewe heavily, "is that there was no one to do it. That is the whole of my trouble, Mr. Holmes, and I have not slept for it. The compartment was locked from the junction to the terminus. 6 souls were locked into it. I have the guard's count, and I have the tickets to prove it. 6 passengers in that compartment, no more and no less, and one of those 6 is the dead man. That leaves 5. And of those 5, Inspector Lestrade and I have spent the whole of this day satisfying ourselves, one by one, that not one of them is your murderer. And yet a man is dead with a needle's wound in his neck, in a locked box on a train that did not stop, among 5 people who could not have done it. You see my difficulty. Either one of 5 innocent persons is a murderer, which I cannot believe, or a 7th person was in that compartment whom no door admitted, and no door released, and no ledger of mine has ever heard of. A 7th passenger, Mr. Holmes, who got into a locked room out of the fog and out again, and left a dead man behind him for his trouble." There was a long silence. Holmes had closed his eyes. His fingertips were pressed together beneath his chin, and I knew better than to disturb him. When he spoke at last, it was almost dreamily. 6 tickets, he said. 6 passengers. You are very sure of your 6, Mr. Crewe. As sure as I am of my own name. The guard, Albert Strout, is a man I would trust with the crown jewels. He counted them aboard at the junction with his own eyes and his own lantern, ticket by ticket, face by face, and locked the door upon them himself. 6. And the dead man, who is he? His name is Hector Vane, said Crewe. A gentleman of the city, so far as we knew. A man of business, quiet, respectable, well-dressed, who traveled the line often and gave no trouble to anyone. I had seen him a dozen times upon the platform, and tipped my cap to him and thought no more of it. An ordinary gentleman, Mr. Holmes, of the most ordinary kind. Holmes opened his eyes, and there was in them a curious light. An ordinary gentleman of the most ordinary kind, he repeated, found murdered by an expert hand in a sealed room. Mr. Crewe, in my experience, the ordinary is the most expensive disguise a man can buy, and the most dangerous, precisely because it costs the observer nothing to accept it. Watson, your boots and your revolver. We shall not sleep tonight, but I fancy we shall be the more interesting for it. There is a train, a dead man, a locked door, and a person whom everyone has agreed not to see. I should very much like to make that person's acquaintance. We reached the great terminus a little before dawn, and I shall not soon forget the look of it in that hour. The vast iron vault overhead lost in fog and smoke, the gas lamps burning sickly along the empty platforms, the dripping silence broken only by the slow exhalations of a cooling engine somewhere far down the line. The express had been drawn off into a siding under guard, and there in carriage and compartment everything had been left, by Lestrade's order, exactly as it was found. Holmes would not let any of us enter ahead of him. He stood for a long while upon the platform in the cold, looking at the locked door of that compartment from a distance, his head a little on one side, before he would so much as touch the handle. "The lock first, Mr. Crewe. Show me how it is worked." The guard Strout was fetched, a spare, upright, gray man with the grave manner of one who has done his duty all his life, and now finds his duty doubted. He demonstrated the company key, and how the door, once locked, presented to the inside passenger only a smooth plate where the handle should be, so that no one within could open it, and how from without on a moving train a man would need to be a fly to cling there at all, let alone work a key. Holmes examined the lock through his glass for a long time. He examined the window straps, which were buckled fast on the inside, the windows themselves shut, and the catches sound. He examined the hinges, the floor, the cushions, the netting of the luggage rack, the very dust upon the sill. Then, at last, he stepped up into the compartment, and we crowded behind him as far as we dared. The dead man sat in the far corner as he had been found, a stout, well-fed, well-dressed man of perhaps 50, his head fallen back, his face purpled, his eyes half open with that dreadful incuriosity of the dead. I have seen a great many bodies, in war and in peace, and there was nothing about this one to mark it from a sleeper save the stillness and the small dark stain, no larger than a tear, that had crept down inside his collar from the place at the back of his neck, where the surgeon's probe had been. "You see the seat opposite," said Holmes quietly. He was not looking at the body at all. He was looking at the bench across from the dead man, where the worn plush had been pressed and creased by occupants now gone. "Mr. Crewe, who sat there?" "The lady, sir, Mrs. Marbury. A widow of good family, traveling up to London. She was in great distress when the door was opened, as well she might be, having slept the night across from a dead man without knowing it. We sent her home in a cab with a constable. She is among those Lestrade, and I have cleared. A frail, nervous woman, Mr. Holmes, who could no more drive a needle into a man's brain than she could lift the engine." "A frail, nervous woman," said Holmes. "And she sat there, alone." "Alone," said the superintendent. Holmes said nothing for a moment. He laid 2 fingers very lightly upon the pressed plush of the opposite bench, first at one end, and then deliberately at the other. "Then it is strange," he murmured. "That one person, sitting alone through a long night, should have warmed and creased 2 separate places upon her seat, a yard apart, with the clean cushion untouched between them, as though 2 persons had sat there, each keeping to her own corner, in the manner of a lady and someone who is not quite her equal and not quite her servant and knows it." He straightened. "But let us not run ahead. Watson, the dead man's coat." I helped him draw back the heavy overcoat from the body. It was a good coat, dark and well made, and Holmes went over it inch by inch with his lens. Presently he gave a small sound of satisfaction and beckoned me close. "What do you make of this button, Doctor?" It was the second button of the coat, and to my eye it was merely a button. "It is sewn on," I said. "It is sewn on," Holmes agreed, "with black silk thread, very fine, in a close herringbone stitch, by a hand of great skill and patience. And recently Watson, for the thread is bright and unworn, while every other button on this coat is held by the coarse loose work of a tailor's man or the careless mending of a bachelor's landlady. Here is a man who, somewhere within the last day, had a button beautifully repaired by a fine needlewoman. A man does not stop in the street to have his coat mended. This was done at leisure, in a quiet hour, by someone who carried a work basket and the habit of using it, and who, I will venture, was sitting near enough to him to do it. He paused. There was a needlewoman in this compartment, Watson, and our murderer struck with a thing no thicker than a needle. I do not say the two are the same. I say only that I dislike coincidences, and that I have not yet been offered one I could believe. He turned next to the floor and crouched, and was silent a long time. The dust upon the boards of an old compartment is a kind of register. Holmes was fond of saying that no clerk can falsify. At length he pointed. Here are the marks of the dead man's boots. Here are a lady's small heels, sharp and deep, before the opposite seat, Mrs. Marbury. And here, his finger moved to a place near the door, half under the bench, are the prints of a third pair of feet, a woman's again, but flat and heavy, and worn down at the heel as the boots of a person who is much upon her feet are worn, a person who stands while others sit. 3 persons, Watson, have left their marks where the company's ledger admits of only 2. He rose, brushing his knees. Mr. Crew, your count of 6 grows troublesome. I begin to think you have been counting tickets where you ought to have been counting souls. It was at this moment, as Holmes spoke, that the guard Strout, who had been standing very stiff and unhappy at the carriage door, made a small movement and a smaller sound, as a man does who has remembered something and does not know whether it is worth the saying. You have thought of something, Strout, said Holmes, rounding on him at once. Out with it. I would rather hear a foolish thing that is true than a wise thing that is guessed. It is nothing, sir, said the guard reluctantly. Only, you speak of the lady, Mrs. Marbury. She had her woman with her, sir, her maid. But that's neither here nor there. She was no passenger to count, just the lady's girl, carrying the bags and the basket and seeing to her mistress. A quiet, plain creature in gray. I'd clean forgot her till you spoke of a third pair of feet, for one doesn't, sir, if you take my meaning. One doesn't count the girl. Holmes became very still indeed. No, he said at last, and there was something almost gentle in his voice, the gentleness of a man who has just seen, far off, the shape of the whole thing. No, Strout. One doesn't count the girl. That, I begin to suspect, is the entire and only secret of this affair. But it is too soon. Let us be patient. The dead must give up their own history before the living will give up theirs. Mr. Crew, I should like everything that is known of Mr. Hector Vane, where he lived, and chiefly, how an ordinary gentleman of the most ordinary kind came by money enough to dress like that, and travel first class upon your line 12 times a year. The lodgings of the late Mr. Hector Vane were in a respectable, anonymous street near the river, the kind of street where no one knows his neighbor, and all the curtains are the same shade of brown. His landlady, a sharp, frightened woman, let us in with the air of one who has always known that the quiet gentleman on the first floor would come to no good, though if pressed, she could not have said why she thought so. His rooms were neat, comfortable, and entirely without character, as though the man who lived in them had taken pains to leave no print of himself upon anything. And it was precisely that, Holmes observed, which was the print of him. A man with nothing to hide, Watson, hides nothing, and so his rooms are full of him, his tastes, his vices, his letters, his follies. A man whose whole life is a hidden thing learns to live like this, in a clean cell of his own making, giving the eye nothing to rest upon. I have seen it before. I should be very much surprised if Mr. Vane's true life were not written down somewhere with great care, for such men cannot bear to trust their treasure to memory. He found it within the hour, behind a panel in the writing desk that yielded to his probing knife. A thick ledger, bound in plain black, and within it, page upon page in a small precise hand, not the accounts of any honest trade, but a darker accounting altogether. There were names, scores of them, and against each name a sum of money, and against each sum a few words. A date, a place, a single phrase that was enough, when one read it, to feel the cold come into the room. For the ledger of Hector Vane was a ledger of secrets. He was a collector and a seller of the shameful things that respectable people will pay, and go on paying, rather than have spoken aloud. A blackmailer of the most patient and methodical kind, who had made his quiet first-class living for 20 years out of the terror of his betters. "Here is our ordinary gentleman," said Holmes, turning the pages by lamplight. "Here is the danger that wore the brass-buttoned coat of respectability and tipped its hat upon the platform, and that Mr. Crewe saw a dozen times and never saw at all. Every name in this book is a person who had reason to wish him dead, Watson, and any one of them might have found the courage at last. The difficulty is not to find a motive. The difficulty will be to find the one motive that was in that locked compartment." His finger stopped upon a page. He was very quiet. "And here," he said, "is a name I have already heard tonight, Marbury, Mrs. Adelaide Marbury, a widow of good family, who sat alone through the night opposite the man who was bleeding her white, and who was not, the ledger says, his first victim of that name." I looked over his shoulder. Below the entry for Mrs. Marbury, in the same precise hand but older ink, browned with years, was another entry, struck through with a single line as a closed account is struck through. And the name upon it was not Marbury at all, but one I shall write here only as Esther C., with a date 11 years gone, and after it 3 words that Hector Vane had set down as a man of business sets down the settling of a debt, and that I have never been able to forget. The 3 words were, "paid in full." "What does it mean, Holmes?" "It means," said he, closing the book, "that 11 years ago this man destroyed a woman named Esther and recorded it as one might record the collection of her rent, and that he was at the time of his death engaged in destroying a second woman, Mrs. Marbury, by the same patient method. It means that we are no longer looking for a murderer, Watson. We are looking for someone's grief. Those are 2 very different quarries. The first runs from you. The second very often comes to meet you. We called upon Mrs. Marbury that same afternoon, in the failing gray light, at a narrow house in a once fashionable square where the stucco was peeling and the brass wanted polish, the house of a gentlewoman whose income has not kept pace with her name. A frightened parlor maid showed us into a cold drawing room, and presently Mrs. Marbury herself came down to us, a small, faded, trembling woman of perhaps 55, dressed in widow's black gone rusty at the seams, with the soft, ruined prettiness of a face that has wept too much in private and smiled too much in company. She had been expecting us, or someone like us. That much was plain from the way her hand went to her throat when she saw Holmes's card, and from the careful, brittle composure with which she begged us to sit. "You have come about the dreadful thing upon the train," she said, before either of us could speak. "I have told the inspector everything I know, which is nothing, Mr. Holmes, nothing at all. I slept. God forgive me, I slept the whole night through across from that poor man, and never knew, never dreamed." Her voice failed, and she pressed a small black-edged handkerchief to her lips. "You must not distress yourself, madam," said Holmes, and I have rarely heard him speak so gently. "I have not come to accuse you of anything. I have come only to be told the truth, which is a different and a rarer errand. You knew the dead man, I think. You knew Mr. Hector Vane." I saw the question go through her like a current. For a moment I thought she would deny it. Then something in Holmes's quiet gray gaze undid her, and she seemed all at once to grow smaller in her chair. "I knew him," she whispered. "To my sorrow and my shame, I knew him. There were some letters, Mr. Holmes, from a time in my life I would give my soul to undo, letters that would have ruined my dead husband's name and my son's prospects in the regiment, and this man had them, and for 3 years he has had from me, a little at a time, very politely, very patiently, near everything I possessed. You see this house. You see what I am brought to. I had gone up to the cathedral city to sell the last of my mother's jewels to a discreet person there, that I might pay him again and keep his silence 1 more quarter, and I was coming home with the money in my bag, the price of my mother's pearls, to give it to the man who was bleeding me, when I fell asleep in the same carriage and woke to find him dead. And do you know, Mr. Holmes," she said, and a wild and terrible little laugh escaped her, "my very first thought when they told me he was dead before the horror came was a kind of joy. I am not proud of it, but there it is. I cannot pretend to you that I am sorry he is dead. I can only swear to you that I did not, with these hands, make him so." "I know that you did not," said Holmes simply. She stared at him. "You know it. A woman who has carried the price of her mother's pearls 60 miles to surrender it to her tormentor is not a woman who has just found a simpler way to settle the account," said he. "Had you killed him, Mrs. Marbury, you would not still have the money. You have it yet. I see the very weight of it in the way you have not once let go of that reticule since we entered. No. You slept. Tell me of your sleep. You travel alone." "I had my maid with me," said she, and there was warmth in her tired voice for the first time. "Ruth. My good Ruth. I do not know what I should do without her. Indeed, I do not, and the worst of it is I shall so soon have to, for she is failing, Mr. Holmes, a consumption, the doctors say, and far gone. I hear her cough through the wall at night, and it breaks my heart. She would not be left behind that evening, though her ticket was only for the 2nd class, and she was fit to drop. She begged to ride with me to see to me, she said, the night being cold, and I let her, of course, for who would grudge it? She tucked the rug about my knees with her own hands, and I remember her sitting there in her corner with her little work-basket as I closed my eyes, mending away in the lamplight as she always does, for she cannot abide a thing left ragged, and that, Mr. Holmes, is the last I knew until the door was opened in the morning, and the world had become a nightmare. Surely, she added, with a sudden anxious pity that I have never forgotten, surely no one will trouble poor Ruth over this. She is so weak now and so good, and she has so little time. "No one," said Holmes after a silence, "shall trouble Ruth on my account, madam. You have my word upon it." And he rose and bowed over her hand, and we took our leave, and we walked the length of 2 streets in the gathering dark before he spoke again. "You observed it, Watson," he said at last, very low. "She told us the whole of it, freely, lovingly, and never knew she had. A maid too weak to stand, who begged to ride in a locked compartment with the man who was destroying her mistress, and sat all night in the corner with a work-basket and a fine, sharp needle, mending. We have been shown the murderer, my dear fellow, and the hand that pointed her out to us was the hand of the one person in London who loves her best and must never, never learn what she has done. There is a cruelty in this case that I do not much care for. Come. There is one thread yet I must follow into the country before I dare be certain. For I will hang nothing, not even a certainty, upon a frightened woman's chatter. I will pass quickly over the next stage of the inquiry, in which Lestrade, with the whole apparatus of the yard at his command, set himself to break down the alibis of the 5 living passengers, and in which, for the space of nearly a day, it seemed to all of us, to Lestrade, to the superintendent, and I confess to myself, that we had found our man, and that the impossibility was no impossibility at all. The 5 who had shared that compartment with the dead man were these: the widow Mrs. Marbury, an elderly clergyman of mild and absent manner, a young lieutenant of the line going up to the War Office, and 2 men of business, of whom the more interesting by far was a heavy, talkative commercial traveler named Pug. It was upon Pug that suspicion fastened, and not without reason. He alone of the 5 had been ill at ease under questioning. He alone had a connection with the dead man, for his name, Lestrade discovered, stood in Vane's black ledger for a debt of some hundreds of pounds, and there was mud upon his boots, fresh red mud of a kind not found upon the platform of the terminus. That seemed to speak of a man who had been out upon the open line in the night. The theory that Lestrade built, and that he laid before us at the terminus with great satisfaction, was a bold one, and I will own it carried me with it. It was this, that the express had in fact slowed almost to a stop at a certain point upon its run, where the gradient is steep and the rails wet with fog. That Pug, having killed Vane with some thin instrument while the others slept, had at that point opened the window, worked the outer lock by some means, and dropped from the slow-moving train into the dark, to make his way across country and account for himself elsewhere, and that the mud upon his boots was the mud of that wild. The 7th passenger in this theory was no phantom at all, but Pug himself, who had been counted aboard and had simply not been counted off, having left the train by a door that the rules said could not open, at a place the rules said it did not stop. "It hangs together, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, rubbing his hands. "It hangs together from end to end. He had the motive, the debt. He had the means. Any traveler carries a hat-pin or a bodkin or a long pin for his samples. He had the mud. And he had the chance, for the train did slow upon the bank. The driver admits it. What more do we want?" Holmes had listened to all of this with his eyes half closed and his chin sunk upon his breast, and for a moment I thought he would let it stand. Then he sighed, and it was the sigh of a man laying down a comfortable thing he would rather not let go. "It is a very pretty theory, Lestrade," he said, "and it has only one fault, which is that every single part of it is wrong." He held up a long finger before the inspector could protest. "Let us take it as you have built it. The train slowed upon the bank. Yes, the driver admits it. It slowed to perhaps 15 miles in the hour for the space of half a minute. I have stood today upon that bank. A man who dropped from a carriage there in the dark at 15 miles in the hour, onto the rough ballast and the steep wet grass, would not walk away across country. He would lie at the foot of the embankment with his bones broken, and we should have found him there this morning. We did not. Second, the outer lock. I have examined that door and that lock with the greatest care, inside and out. It has not been touched. There is rust in the wards undisturbed. There is paint upon the hinge unbroken. No key has turned in it, and no window strap has been unbuckled and rebuckled, for the dust on the buckle is whole. That door was not opened between the junction and the terminus by any living hand. Third, the mud. Yes, it is red mud, and no, it is not from the platform. It is from the cab yard at the junction, where I observed this morning that the company has lately laid down red gravel from the same pit, and where Mr. Pug, like every passenger, crossed to reach his train. And fourth and last, Holmes drew from his pocket a slip of paper. The debt, Mr. Pug's debt to Hector Vane, was real. It was also, as the ledger itself records on its final page, settled and struck through 3 weeks ago, paid not in fear but in the ordinary way of business, for it was an honest loan and not a blackmailer's bleeding at all. Vane, you see, was a money-lender to the world's eye and a blackmailer in his secret heart, and the two trades wore the same coat. Pug owed him nothing, feared him nothing, and killed him not at all. Your 7th passenger, Lestrade, did not jump from the train. I am sorry. It would have been a great convenience if he had. There was a silence after this, and I felt, as I think we all felt, the floor open again beneath us. For if Lestrade's theory was wrong in every part, if the door had not been opened, if no man had jumped, if the one passenger with a motive had none, then we were returned, and worse than returned, to the bare and dreadful fact with which the superintendent had begun. A man murdered by an expert hand in a sealed box that no one had entered and no one had left, among a company of persons, not one of whom could have done it. The impossibility had not been solved. It had only been made larger and colder and more complete. Then where are we, Mr. Holmes? Said Crewe, and his voice cracked upon the words. Where in God's name are we? We are, said Holmes, exactly where we have been since the first moment, Mr. Crewe, only we have wasted a day in proving it. We are facing a count of 6 that ought to be a count of 7. You have all of you from the first been counting the wrong thing. You have counted tickets and passengers and gentlefolk. You have not once counted people. Strout counted 6 because 6 is the number of persons whom a guard of 40 years' training has been taught, all his life, to see. And there was a 7th person in that compartment whom Strout did not count, not because she was hidden, but because she was exactly where she was expected to be, doing exactly what she was expected to do, wearing exactly the gray that such persons wear. And we do not count Watson. We have trained ourselves all our lives not to count, the woman who carries the basket and stands while her betters sit. The murderer did not break into your sealed room, Mr. Crewe. The murderer walked into it through the front door at the junction, in plain sight, openly, with a ticket of a sort, and walked out of it again at the terminus in plain sight, openly, and melted into the crowd of her own kind upon the platform, and not one of your 40 years of order so much as turned its head. There is your impossible escape. It was never an escape at all. It was an invisibility, and you yourselves supplied it. It remains for me to set down how Holmes proved this thing, which he had now guessed, and how the proving of it led us by slow and painful steps to the saddest interview I think I ever sat through, and to do that I must speak of the maid. Her name, we learned, was Ruth Pell, and she had been with Mrs. Marbury some 4 years, and had been, before that, in another service in the West Country, 11 and more years gone. Holmes, when he heard the length of that earlier service and the place of it, grew very quiet, and sent at once a long telegram into the country, and waited upon the answer with a patience that I knew for the opposite of calm. When it came, he read it twice, and passed it to me without a word, and I understood at last the shape of the grief we had been hunting from the beginning. For Ruth Pell had once been maid and more than maid, companion, friend, almost sister, the telegram said, for they had been girls together, to a young woman named Esther Carow, and Esther Carow was the Esther C. of the black ledger, the account struck through and marked paid in full 11 years before. Hector Vane had got some letters of hers, some foolish, girlish letters that meant nothing and might be made to mean anything, and he had bled her with them quietly for 2 years, until the shame and the secrecy and the slow ruin of it had broken her, and she had walked one gray morning into a mill pond and not come out. And the woman who had drawn her cold from the water and laid her out, and buried what was left of her hope along with her, was Ruth Pell, who had then gone away into another county and another service and made herself small and gray and silent and useful, and waited, though I do not think she knew herself how patiently she waited, or for what. What she could not have foreseen, what no one could have foreseen, was that the wheel would come full round, that her new mistress, the gentle, nervous Mrs. Marbury, would fall in her turn into the same patient net, and that Ruth Pell would come to recognize, in the quiet, respectable gentleman who traveled so often upon the line and tipped his hat upon the platform, the very face of the thing that had killed the girl she loved. She had seen him board the train that night. She had seen which compartment he took. And she had asked her mistress, very humbly, as a good maid asks, whether she might not ride in the same compartment rather than the second class for which her ticket was bought, the night being cold and her mistress unwell and in need of attendance. And Mrs. Marbury, who knew nothing, who suspected nothing, who was herself half sick with her own secret terror of the man across the aisle, had said yes, of course, as one says yes to a faithful servant, and had thought no more of it, and had then, exhausted by fear and lulled by the dark and the long rocking of the train, fallen at last into a heavy sleep. And in that sleep, in the locked and rushing dark, Ruth Pell had taken from her own gray hair a long steel pin, the commonest thing in the world, the thing every woman in England carries, the thing no searcher thinks twice to find upon a lady's maid, and had crossed the small space of that compartment, and had done, with one sure stroke at the base of the skull, the thing she had perhaps been going to do in her secret, unspeaking heart for 11 years. And then she had sat down again in her own corner, and she had taken out her work-basket, for her hands, she told us afterward, would not be still, and seeing a button hanging loose upon the dead man's coat, for she could not bear, even then, even him, a thing left ragged and undone, she had leaned across in the dark and sewn it firm with a close and beautiful herringbone stitch, and bitten off the thread, and folded her hands, and waited for the morning and the terminus and the unlocking of the door. We found her, I will not say where, for it does not matter now, and she asked us at the last that the place should not be written down. It was Holmes who insisted that we go to her at all, when Lestrade would have been content to take Mrs. Marbury, the obvious and respectable suspect, and trust to the assizes to sort the rest. No, Holmes had said, in that flat, hard voice he used so rarely. I will not have an innocent and broken woman stand in the dock for the deed of the only person in this affair who has the right to be heard. We will go to the maid. And we had gone, and we had found her, and I knew the moment I saw her, why she had not feared the law, and why she had not run, and why she had been able to do with so steady a hand, a thing that would have shaken the nerve of a soldier. For Ruth Pell was dying. She had been dying for a year and more, of the slow consumption that hollows the cheek and lights the eye and gives, at the very end, a kind of terrible energy to those it is about to take. She had known when she boarded that train that she had only weeks of her own life remaining, and she had spent one of those weeks. She said this to us quite simply, sitting very upright in a hard chair with a spotted handkerchief pressed in her thin hand, settling, as she put it, the last of Esther's account. She did not ask our pity, and she did not offer us her defense. She said only that the man had killed her girl and was killing her mistress, and that the law had had 11 years to touch him and had not so much as known his name, and that she had had a steel pin and a steady hand and very little time, and had done what was left to her to do. And then she coughed into the spotted handkerchief and folded it away and asked Mr. Holmes, with the grave courtesy of her class, whether her mistress need ever know. I have seen Holmes face down murderers with a smile and walk unmoved among the worst that London could show him, but I never saw him as I saw him then. He stood a long moment looking at that gray, dying woman in the hard chair, and then he did a thing I have never wholly been able to account for and have never wished to. He bowed to her, a slight grave bow such as one gentleman gives another, and he said, "Madam, your mistress need never know. And I think, if you will forgive an old hunting dog the impertinence, that there is a court above the assizes which has had your case before it for some little time already, and will not now be hurried by anything I might say to a London jury. I will trouble you no further. Good night." And we went out and left her there, and said nothing on the long, cold road back to the city. She died, I afterward learned, within the month, quietly in her bed, attended to the end by the mistress she had served and saved and never told. The official record of the death of Mr. Hector Vane stands to this day, I believe, as death by a person or persons unknown, the case never closed and never solved, a small permanent scandal upon the order of which poor Superintendent Crewe was so proud. Holmes told Crewe the truth privately that he might sleep again, and Crewe, who was an honest man and not a fool, understood why the truth was not for the newspapers and held his peace. Mrs. Marbury he never approached at all. The black ledger Holmes burned, page by page, in our own grate in Baker Street, and I think he counted it among the better evening's work of his life, for every name in it was a life that could now go on a little less afraid. We sat late before the fire on the night he burned it, and for a long while neither of us spoke, watching the precise small writing curl and blacken and go up the chimney into the fog. It was I who broke the silence at last, for the thing still troubled me. "Holmes," I said, "all that day at the terminus, the jumping man, the open door, the 7th passenger out of the dark, we were so sure." And the answer was there the whole time in the guard's own first words, if we had had the wit to hear it. One doesn't count the girl. It was no impossible crime at all. "There are no impossible crimes, Watson," said Holmes, leaning back, his face very tired and very content in the red light. "There are only crimes committed inside the blind spot of the observer, and we are each of us furnished with the most generous blind spots that money and custom can supply. The whole art of the thing was not in the locked door. A locked door is a simple mechanism. A man can reason about it. The art was in the lock that custom had set upon all our eyes, which no one had ever thought to reason about at all, because no one knew it was there. Crewe counted 6 because his training had taught him, year upon year, that a maid is not a passenger, but a part of her mistress's luggage, a thing carried, not a soul traveling. Strout forgot her in the very act of seeing her. And we ourselves, you and I, who pride ourselves that we see what others miss, we spent a whole day chasing a phantom out of the fog because it never once occurred to us that the 7th passenger had not come from outside the ordinary at all, but from the very heart of it, that she had been standing in plain sight on the platform the whole time, holding the basket, waiting to be invisible. He was quiet a moment. It is the oldest disguise there is, Watson, and the cheapest, and the only one that never fails. To be exactly what everyone expects, and therefore not to be seen. The most dangerous secret in London is never the one in the locked box. It is the one in the open hand that no one thinks worth the trouble of opening. The fire sank, and the last black page of Hector Vane's accounting went up in a single bright thread and was gone. Outside, the fog pressed gray and patient against the glass, full, no doubt, of ordinary persons going about their ordinary business, each one carrying his own unopened secret through the dark. And somewhere among them I could not help but think, going home quiet and gray and uncounted past 100 incurious eyes, walked others like her, whom we should none of us ever see at all until the day they chose to let us. "Come, Watson," said Holmes, rousing himself and reaching for his violin. "It has been a melancholy business, and the dawn is a long way off. Let us see whether a little music cannot make the fog more bearable." And he played very softly far into the morning, while I sat and watched the embers and thought of a steel pin, and a sewn button, and a girl drawn cold from a mill pond 11 years before, and of all the patient, faithful, invisible people who hold our baskets and stand while we sit, and whom we never think until it is too late to count.